Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mr. President, for that wonderful introduction. And I would like to acknowledge someone who was really a partner with us as we pursued the American view that no man, woman, or child should have to live in tyranny, and that's First Lady Laura Bush. Thank you very much for all that you did. Well, the President said that he is now retired. This doesn't look like retirement to me. And in fact, I have been out of government now for 2.5 years or so, and I'm back at Stanford University. And the thing that's changed most in my life is that I get up every morning, I read the newspaper, and I think, isn't that interesting? And then I go on to whatever else. But indeed, it is interesting. These are remarkable, remarkable times. As I watched the little clip of President Bush's second inaugural, it struck me that he made in those remarks a very powerful moral case for democracy and freedom. A case that those of us who are fortunate enough to live on the right side of history, to enjoy the freedoms and liberties that we very often take for granted, have a moral obligation to stand with those who are still seeking the simple dignity, the simple enjoyment that we have of being able to say what we think, to choose those who are going to govern us, to worship as we please, to educate our boys and our girls, to be free from the knock of the secret police at night, and to be free from the arbitrary power of the government. Those are great pleasures and great joys. But if we don't remember those who do not yet have those, then we ourselves are shirking our own responsibilities and our own obligations. And so there's a strong moral case for democracy. But there's a practical case, too. I was always struck that people often talked about those of us who advocated for freedom as idealists, somehow contrasting us with those who were realistic about the world. But we are seeing that the moral case is not the only case for democracy. There is a practical case. The reality is that men, women, and children will not long be denied the freedoms that they seek because it is a universal urging for those freedoms. That practical case that's playing out in the streets of the Middle East today is teaching us something very important. For more than 60 years, the United States, while advocating for democracy in many, many parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, Europe, talked not about democracy in the Middle East, but about stability. We actually talked about stability, not democracy, and we got neither. Because authoritarianism is actually not stable. You see, every authoritarian fears what I've come to call the Ceausescu moment. When we were in Romania, Mr. President, the people told us about a moment when, as revolutions were sweeping across Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and East Germany, the dictator of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, went into a square in Bucharest, 250,000 people in the square, and he was exhorting the people about what he had done for them. And then all of a sudden, one old lady yelled, "Liar." Then 10 people, then 100 people, then 1,000 people. And then 100,000 people are yelling liar. And now Ceausescu realizes something's wrong, he'd better get out of there. And so he turns to a young military officer who is supposed to helicopter him to freedom, and instead delivers him to the revolution, and he and his wife Elena are executed. The Ceausescu moment is the moment that every authoritarian fears. And that is the moment when the only thing standing between the authoritarian and his people breaks down, and that is fear itself. When fear breaks down and one old lady yells liar, or a policeman refuses to fire, or an army officer turns his tank away from the crowd, the authoritarian has lost his power over his people. Fear is gone, and all that remains is anger. And anger is a terrible way to make political reform and transition. That is why we adopted in the Freedom Agenda the view that we had to encourage reform, yes, for moral reasons, but for practical reasons as well. And that reform is going to come now, but it now comes in the Middle East in the context of anger, not the calm that could have been there had the reforms been begun earlier. And so now it's going to be rocky. There are going to be voices that we don't want to hear, saying things that we do not like. But it is better than the silence of tyranny, which does nothing but to cover that anger, make it seethe to the point that it explodes. The extremist forces in the Middle East are indeed strong. Indeed, they are some of the best organized forces in the Middle East. And that, too, is no accident. I can remember speaking with authoritarian leaders in the Middle East. Particularly, I remember one conversation with President Mubarak in June of 2005. I was about to give a speech at the American University of Cairo in which I would advocate for political reform in Egypt to lead that political reform. And President Mubarak, in the meeting that morning, I didn't want him to be surprised, so I told him what I was going to say. And he said, "You don't know my people." He said, "They need a strong hand. It's me or the Muslim Brotherhood." And in fact, the authoritarians were engaging in policies that made that true. It was self-fulfilling prophecy, because decent political forces were cut out of the public square. Decent political forces were hounded by the secret police. They were not allowed to form political parties. Civil society was denied its voice. But the extremists, they operated and organized in the radical madrasas and in the radical mosques. And there's a reason that they are the best organized forces today. But that is no reason to lose heart, because in the open air of contested politics, perhaps the slogan, "Elect us, and we will impose Sharia law," "Elect us, and we will make your children suicide bombers," perhaps those slogans will not do so well in open contested politics. And so let them contest. But it will be rocky, and it will be difficult. And so what are we to do in a region that is so important to us, but where, frankly, the reform has come so late? Well, we do have some important levers to shape events in the Middle East. I was always struck when people said, you know, you can't impose democracy. And I would say that's absolutely right. You don't have to impose democracy. You impose tyranny. Democracy, if allowed to flourish, does emerge. But it's hard, and it's tough, and it takes time. So what are we to do? Well, first of all, strengthen the seedlings of democracy that are in the Middle East already. And there are three to which I would point. Iraq. Iraq, as our soon-to-be ex-Secretary of Defense, but a great man, Bob Gates, said, who would have thought several months ago that Iraq might be the best example of multi-ethnic, multi-confessional democracy? A democracy that is, to be sure, fragile, where they yell at each other and they say terrible things to each other, and sometimes they even march in the streets, as Muqtada Sadr's forces have recently done. But they do have political institutions to which they are referring. And I'll just tell you one little vignette that says something about what happens when political institutions are in place. An Iraqi legislator visited Israel. And when he came back, the Iraqi parliament tried to strip him of his citizenship. But the Iraqi Supreme Court said Iraqi citizens have the right to travel. You see, institutions, constitutions, documents that establish the relationship between the governed and those who would govern are not always immediately effective, but they are there, and people appeal to them. We have in our own history an example in that way. When Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks wanted to change America in the South where I was born, they didn't have to say that America needed to be something else, only that America had to be what it said it was. Institutions matter. And in Iraq, there are institutions. Strengthen them, strengthen those seedlings as a way and a beacon for the rest of the Middle East. Lebanon. a country with a sad history of confessional conflict, but nonetheless, where on March 14th of 2005, a Lebanese sovereign government, more Western-oriented, willing to take on Syria, emerged. And even though there have been ups and downs in Lebanon, it is a different place than it was in 2003 or 2004. Strengthen those democratic forces. And in the West Bank of Palestine, where despite all of the turbulence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a government under Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad has built in the West Bank institutions and security forces that show us what a Palestinian state, a democratic Palestinian state, might look like. And so strengthen Iraq, strengthen Lebanon, strengthen the West Bank of Palestine. Help support, secondly, healthy forces in places like Egypt and Tunisia, where there is something to work with. I see many people in this audience who have trained democracy advocates in those countries over the last several years, who've helped to build civil society, who've helped people to understand how to form political parties. We have good relations with professional armies that perhaps can be stabilizing forces. And so strengthen those forces, those healthy political forces in Egypt and Tunisia and places like that. Third, press friends to reform faster than they might. And there the monarchs of the Middle East have an opportunity. Places like Jordan, Morocco, with reformist young kings who perhaps can be pushed forward to constitutional monarchy, which is the future of monarchy in the Middle East if it is to have a future. And even in troubled Bahrain and in conservative Saudi Arabia, there are seeds of reform. I note that King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia has created a new grand university because he recognized that the people of Saudi Arabia were learning no skills of real use in the 21st century. They were going to universities that just taught religious orthodoxy. And so the new university, where women will have their own area to study, is a potential element for reform. It can be women's empowerment. It can be freeing of civil society. It can be independent judiciaries, education for the people, the beginnings of a franchise for the people. But we have to tell our friends, those who have not accelerated reforms, that the Middle East is not going backward. They have no choice but to push forward and push forward quickly. You see, the fact is that the same principle has to be inviolable for the United States. Every man, woman, and child deserves to live in freedom. But the application of that principle to different circumstances requires different strategies and different tools. And so when you come to the irreconcilables and the unreconcilables, like Syria and Iran, come on. They're not going to make the transition to democracy. And they continue to be, for the United States, not just a problem for our values, but a problem for our security too. The world will be better off without Bashar al-Assad and better off without the mullahs in Iran. And it's time to say so.